My name's Adam House and I'm a fraud. Thank you so much for joining me on this, our final episode of this first series of Fraud, a podcast where I talk to people that I think are doing amazing things in the world of development and cultural build and ask them if they have ever felt like a fraud themselves, and if so, how they push past it to do the great stuff they're doing. And I am delighted for this final episode to be having a conversation with Adam Pacey. Now, Adam Pacey, of all the guests that I've had this season, he is the first that I've actually seen do his thing in real life, where we were both part of an executive leadership development day. And it was fantastic to meet him for the first time there and start to understand where it is he was coming from in the world of development. And he's primarily known for being an executive coach, a leadership coach, a careers coach, a teams coach. Basically, if you want coaching, then he's your guy. And it was wonderful to start talking to him about this podcast and seeing if he'd like to come on board to have a look at it. I will say that this is potentially the most forensic look of any of the conversations we've had, where Adam really goes deep into his career from the very beginnings and the fraudulent way he came about first entering into the world of finance and numbers, all the way through to his focus shifting from numbers to people, and then leading on to where we find him now. It's fantastic and fascinating to hear how he has taken what a lot of people could see as limiting fraudulent beliefs and actually turned them into a bit of a superpower. I'll talk more about that at the end, but for now, I hope you'll join me. And there's really only one question to start us off. Adam Pacey, are you a fraud?
Well, thank you for the question. The answer is without a shadow of a doubt, yes, and multiple times, in fact, a serial fraud, you might call it. And actually, I'm very comfortable with that, and I think it's actually the norm, not the exception.
Okay.
Which is very comfortable for me. But I think it should be for everyone. So, you know, if I think back to sort of various different iterations of being a fraud, it starts very early. You know, even as far back as going to university. You know, my assumption was I would never go to university, but then I ended up at university, and I don't think there was a day that went by when I was there when I didn't think, "Good Lord, what am I doing here?" I didn't think I'd be doing this.
What is it you did at university?
Sorry.
What is it you did at university?
I did international relations with a focus on security studies, which.
Right.
I mean, I knew nothing about that, right?
Yeah.
And you know, as you do, but you know, by the end of it, I kind of knew a little bit, and that felt pretty good. And I think that's quite an important point, really, is that, you know, when you start to do anything new, you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And by the end of it, you hope you know a little bit.
Yeah.
But you're not going to know it all.
Yeah.
So that feeling of sort of fraudmanship never really goes away.
Yeah.
Because you never know it all. It doesn't matter what you're doing or how long you've been doing it. You know, there's still more to learn. And that's why I say it's the norm, not the exception, because that's just the way the world is. There's an awful lot of stuff out there, and we can never know it all.
Yeah.
And then that sort of that fraudulent journey continued when I left university, and I went to work, and I was working in the civil service down in Southampton, or close to Southampton. And cut a very long story short, I was in a relationship at the time, and the person I was in a relationship with, who I'd met at university, wanted to live in London. So I decided that it would be a good idea for me to move to London.
Yeah.
To sort of primarily driven by the relationship, frankly, not by the city itself or what opportunities were there.
Yeah.
And And so in those days, I wasn't looking on Google. I was looking through the newspaper and leafing through the newspaper and came across an advert for a brand that I recognised.
Yeah.
And purely based on the fact I recognised the brand, I applied for the job with no knowledge of what the job was or what it involved or whether I'd be any good at it. And it certainly didn't have anything to do with international relations. It was a finance-based role. So I applied for it. And next thing I know, much the same as university, I'm sat in a different city, rocking up to the front door of this enormous office to do a job that I didn't know how to do for a company I knew nothing more about than the recognizing their logo.
Yeah.
And wandered into the university and into the interview, sorry, and spent the next probably 6 hours essentially lying about what I was capable of. So, I mean, how you can come away from that experience not feeling like a fraud, it baffles me.
Yeah.
And they believe the lie.
Yeah.
And you know, and that was a two-way thing, because I'm sure they were over egging the opportunities that the role held and all of that sort of stuff, you know. So we got through that merry dance and got the job, and I turned up, and I remember the guy who had championed me sort of through the interview process and who I worked quite closely with when I first started, saying to me after the interview, and once I'd started, he said that the only reason I'd got the job was because my suit was worse than everybody else's. And he said anyone brave enough to wear a suit that bad deserved an opportunity. So any of those feelings of sort of being a fraud and not having the right to be there were hugely reinforced by the fact that I was now being told by the person who championed me, and a senior person at the firm, had given me the opportunity, not through capability, talent, or performance in the interview process, purely through a sort of bad dress sense, which...
That's brilliant.
Yeah, it was quite an experience. So
it's a fascinating thing, because it's not something that I've talked about in any of the podcasts that I've done with people discussing fraudiness, but the interview process, especially the old school interview process, I mean, talk about having to kind of embody fraudiness throughout it. And you're absolutely right. I've always found interviews horrific because you can't help but, as you say, lie to some extent, because you're trying to show all of your best qualities on your best days and trying to guess what it is that they want, if it's a job that you really want or really need. Yeah, I've never really thought about it before, but what a baptism of fire that you're basically, as you say, you've got two people in a room on some level lying to one another, and then offering someone a job at the end of it.
You know, it never ceases to amaze me that we're a couple of years away from landing on Mars, and we've been to the moon, but we've not come up with a better way of working out whether someone is suitable for a role other than sticking them in a room for an hour and asking them a bunch of scripted questions that we're doing in between meetings when we're too busy and half distracted. And then we expect them not to be authentic, which has to be one of the qualities we're looking for. We expect them to lie to fit the job description, and then take them on. And then we complain about the fact that they weren't quite as they seemed in the interview. And they complain about the fact that the company wasn't quite what they expected. It's bizarre to me. So you know, and in that sense, we reward being a fraud.
Yeah.
You know, that the reward on offer is that we'll give you this job if you're the best fraud.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is truly bizarre to me. But, you know, and I think, and you're right to say, particularly old school, because I think we've got better. So I think the amount of creativity that's been injected into the interview process, and more selection process rather than interview process, is healthy. But I think we're miles behind. You know, when we've got, there'll come a day when you'll sit down in an interview opposite ChatGPT, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it'll assess whether your answers were better than anyone else's.
Yeah.
And it's highly likely you'll have walked in there having prepared your answers using ChatGPT.
Yeah.
So we could just take the humans out of the process and they can talk to each. So it fascinates me, that whole sort of process. But the essence being that it is a process which rewards the best fraud. So it's and that's true in a lot of contexts, I think. So it's no wonder that and again, this is why I say it's the norm, not the exception. It's no wonder that that sort of our temptation to be a fraud, or our necessity to be a fraud, comes from the fact that it's rewarded highly the better we are at it. And I continued to do that. I didn't know what I was doing. But I needed to progress, so I made it up as I went along. And I think that phrase as well, making it up as you go along, is quite interesting. People talk about fake it till you make it and all of that sort of stuff. It's a very common sort of, within a corporate world, it's a very common thing that is peddled. Fake it till you make it up as you go along, etc., etc. And I get it, and I get why people say that. But the reality is, right, if you, and this is a little bit conceptual, but if you take it back to the point where, let's say you've got job A, and on Monday job A didn't exist, and on Tuesday job A was created. Well, someone on the morning of Tuesday sat down and wrote the procedures manual for job A.
Yeah.
And given the fact it didn't exist on Monday, they must have made it up.
Yeah.
So they were making it up.
Yeah.
They just created it out of nowhere. So when you then go and take job A and you look at the procedures manual and you're like, I'm trying to work out how to do this to the best of my ability, and this section here I can't do particularly well, and this section I've got some development needs in, and that sort of thing. You haven't really. You're just as entitled to make it up as the guy who made it up on Tuesday morning was.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes that fraudulent feeling comes from the fact that we sort of look at a script almost of how we're supposed to be, and then we work very, very hard to match that script. But the script is just as fraudulent as you are, right? It was just made up by some guy or girl that morning. It's not, there's not some sort of manual that exists out there as some undiscovered universal truth that we're all hunting for, and that whoever finds it gets this sort of golden seal of performance. We're all just making it up as we go along.
Yeah.
And we're taking whatever somebody made up yesterday and we're refining it a little bit today, and somebody else, after we've finished, will refine it a little bit further, to the point where in the future what we were doing yesterday becomes unrecognizable, and we all gasp at the thought that that's the way things were done, and they're done in a new way. So this is why I don't think the answer yes to are you a fraud is a bad thing. It just means we're part of that evolutionary process, refining what was done yesterday to do it in a different way tomorrow. The moment we're devoid of frauds is the moment that we stop progressing, because it means that nobody's trying something new. And
that's interesting.
I think trying something new is an interesting sort of tangent almost, because that trying something new implies risk. And so I think there's quite a strong correlation between being a fraud, trying something new, and the sort of appetite for taking risk. If you're, the stronger that feeling of being a fraud is, the more likely it is that you're doing something that is alien to you and feels uncomfortable to you. Which means you're probably taking a risk. And the stronger the feeling, the bigger the risk. And there's fun in that, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you're taking a risk, you're putting yourself out there, and if you're taking a risk, you're probably learning something new.
Yeah.
You're probably getting a new experience. You're probably expanding your range of things that you've got involved in or are capable of.
Mm.
And so I think when we get that feeling of being a fraud, sometimes we sort of recoil in horror that, that's going to lead to somebody noticing. Well, I don't think somebody noticing you, putting yourself out there, taking a risk, get involved in something new and expanding your range of experience is something to be afraid of, right?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's a good thing. In fact, I think it's something to be rewarded. And I would always be encouraged in previous corporate life. I would always be encouraged if a member of my team came to me and said they feel quite uncomfortable with what they're about to embark on or what they're involved in.
Yeah.
Because it means they put themselves in a place of discomfort, which means that they're developing, progressing, expanding, whatever, however you want to phrase it.
So going back to you basically going to London City for love and just taking a job that meant that you could be in London. You find yourself in a place where you've gone through the fraudulent process of being hired and they've gone through the fraudulent process of hiring you. So how did you feel in that job, and how long did it take you to go from trying to the natural feeling of trying to acclimate and feel like you're part and you're in the right spot to actually this doesn't feel right, I need to start taking risks? Was there a timeline there? Was it always happening, or is it something that came with experience?
So I think the so I'm naturally I'm quite comfortable with taking risks. So I had a and I kind of, if I don't have, and this is interesting, which I've only just thought of now, really, is I actually get quite uncomfortable if I don't have that feeling of being a fraud,
Right.
because it means I'm not doing anything new. I kind of get bored.
Yeah.
And so for me, quite quickly, I wanted to take those risks, and I wanted to put myself into places where I felt very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I also think that I joined on a graduate scheme, so there's a degree of relativity involved. So, within that group, there was always the person who was taking more risk.
Yeah.
And there was the person who was taking, and so you kind of benchmarked yourself off of each other as to who was putting themselves out there more. Which I think in one sense is healthy, because you get a little bit of that herd mentality, you get a little bit of the sort of being able to benefit from each other's experience. But at the same time, you get a sort of a slightly competitive aspect for who can take the most risk and who can put themselves out there more.
Mm.
The flip side of that, and sort of the shadow side of that, is that you can feel that if you're not at the front of the pack, you can feel like you've failed.
Right.
And that can kind of compound that feeling of being a fraud, because you've sort of done your best at putting yourself out there, but relative to everyone else, you haven't done as well as them.
Right.
And then not only do you feel like a fraud, but you feel like a failing fraud, which is quite a knock on the confidence. And I actually think corporates and graduate schemes in particular don't handle that particularly well. They tend to focus on the brightest shining star.
Yeah.
Pour all of their attention onto that particular person, which can be quite difficult. Gladly, where I was, that didn't happen so much. A little bit, but it didn't happen so much. So I think very quickly I got into a place where I wanted to put myself out there and I wanted change. So over the course of probably I stayed at the firm for a long time. So over the course of 10 years there, I think I probably had 5 or 6 different jobs in very, very different areas across the firm, with completely, and it was a big firm, so the reporting lines sort of had nothing to do. They were very, very disparate across the organisation. And each time I took one of those new roles, I needed to reinvent myself. And
Right.
the feeling of being a fraud was entirely refreshed. And I got to go through the whole thing again. And I found a slight degree of comfort in that, as I say, because it meant I knew I was taking a risk and putting myself out there. But at the same time, I got two other sensations, I would say, along with it. One was exhaustion. So the feeling of having to go through that whole process of not having a clue what I did, feeling like a fraud, feeling like an imposter, feeling like I was going to fail, feeling like I was taking it's tiring. It's tiring. And so going through that process multiple times was exhausting. And the other sensation that came along with it, I think, was probably a fear, and one of, is this the time that my ability to blag it doesn't work?
Right. Yeah.
And every time feeling that that sensation that not only was I taking a risk in pursuit of development and a new opportunity, but actually was I taking a reckless risk, because I'd already got past that intense feeling of fraudulent behavior in the last role. Shouldn't I have just banked that and ridden the crest of that wave for the rest of my career, sort of thing? But, being that sort of serial risk taker and serial fraud, then I had to move on to the next one.
With that in mind, were there ever any points that you can remember where the feeling of getting past that fraudulent, I shouldn't be here, I'm having to reinvent myself, to that crest of wave where, no, I've done the hard yards and now I feel comfortable where I am? Has there ever been has it ever debilitated you, I think is what I'm trying to ask? Has it ever gave you pause for, I'm not sure I want, or I'm in the psychologically safe enough place to launch my next fraudulent adventure, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that feeling of exhaustion comes with that. And there's also, and I think this is a bit of a seesaw. So with that sort of, it's A, it's tiring, and B, there's always that thought in the back of your mind that maybe this is the time that my blagging it doesn't work. And I think with that, your appetite to weather that storm changes based on other things you've got going on in your life. So, for example, if you're straight out of university on a graduate scheme, you've come off a graduate scheme, your appetite and your energy to be able to take that challenge on is very different to if you're mid-career with a family and a mortgage and lots of responsibilities and that sort of thing. And I think we see that a lot. So we see people who, and myself included, we see people who have reached a point where they don't have the appetite to take on that risk anymore.
Yeah.
And they'd rather bank what they have today rather than embark on, to use your phrase, which is wonderful, a new fraudulent adventure. And in some senses, I completely understand that, and I'm a big fan of it, and I felt it myself.
Yeah.
And in some senses, it breaks my heart, because that sort of, I'm done now, I'll stop here where I am. And this is in any aspect of life, not even just in a work setting, but just I'll bank this and I'll stay where I am. I can't help but have that sort of deep down, and maybe it's a symptom of being a serial risk taker, but down in my stomach, I can't help but get that feeling, but there's so much out there. There's so much out there. Don't stop. Don't stop. But I completely, by the same token, I completely understand it, and I've absolutely felt it myself. And I think in particular, after the first 10 years, in corporate and in finance, I'd reached a point where, and I'd focused, without going into the details, I'd focused on one particular area, and I'd got quite proficient in that particular area.
Yeah.
And that had started to be beneficial. So actually I was starting to be able to speak more as an expert than as a fraud.
Right.
And that felt really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
That felt really good. And so the lure to not start a new fraudulent adventure was very strong because that felt so good. And it became fun. So I was at the point where that tipped over from feeling fraudulent to actually feeling competent, let's call it, rather than expert, but to be competent in the subject. It started to feel and was quite addictive. But the thing that I noticed at that point was that then allowed me to pour in creativity.
Right.
So I could start to play with the subject.
Yeah.
And I could start to not worry about learning it, but worry about how I might be able to change it and how I might be able to tweak it. And people actually listened.
Yeah.
Which was fabulous.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to, with the serial risk taking and the sort of the multiple fraudulent adventures, I'm not trying to say that we should downplay the benefits of sort of arriving at a comfortable place. But it's what we do with it when we're in that comfortable place. That sort of, for me, and it's a very personal thing. So for me, I chose to use that to inject that creativity in it and play with the subject and leverage that feeling of being competent and people paying a small amount of attention to what I was saying on the subject, rather than just to think, goodness me, I'm just glad I've shaken off the feeling of fraudmanship.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and there's one word in particular which really chimed with me because of my own experience, and that was the word fun, having fun. Because for the longest of times, I was brought up to think that work was something that you weren't supposed to enjoy. And I think that led to some of those fraudulent feelings in the beginning, especially. I don't feel like I should be here. I don't really want to be here. But I don't think I'm supposed to want to be anywhere in a corporate work world. So do I just get miserable, get money, drink and party to forget the miserableness and then continue that cycle? And it wasn't until, as I say, much later and actually finding a leader who asked me what I enjoyed about work. And when they first said it, I thought, this is a trick question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm supposed to lie about this. But actually almost being given the permission to say, find the things you enjoy about work and then lead towards them, and whatever that route looks like. And now I'm in a space where if I'm having fun, then I don't feel as fraudulent quite naturally. If it's something that's exciting and curious and gives me chance to do all of the things that I like most in this world, then I will stick around. That's kind of the North Star, I guess. Now is no longer about what I should be doing or what my title should be or anything like that, and actually much more about, is this project going to be fun, and knowing through my experiences what I do find fun and what I don't, and where the balance is. Is that so it sounds like you kind of got to a space like that yourself, but it also sounds like, as you say, you're almost quite a natural risk taker, and there's only so much level of being in that comfortable, potentially fun space before you are hankering after the next challenge. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, and I reached a point where, and it wasn't by design. I mean, let's not make any mistake. None of this was by design. I'm 49 years old, and I would say 0% of what I've done has been by design.
Yeah.
I've reeled from one experience to the next would probably be the best way I could describe it. Yeah. And I love that. I like that. I'm terrible when I've got a plan in front of me. I'm great working with other people on their plans, but for me, no, no good. And so reeling from one experience to the next, I think I reached a point where fortuitously, and again, it was down to a leader who gave me the opportunity to work with people. So I had a team, and I realized through that, and it took 6 years. This took 6 years for me to realize, which is a decent portion of my life, that I cared less about finance and I cared more about people.
Right.
And that was a tough realization, because the entire infrastructure and culture, not just at that particular firm, but across the industry, was that, and particularly with that industry, it's probably one of the industries that has a reputation for being less people focused.
Yeah.
So to come to that sort of realization that, exactly as you describe, what makes me happy about this particular role is the development of people and working with people. And it's not about spreadsheets and, financial instruments. And I enjoyed that subject as an intellectual challenge, but I also realized that that was an intellectual challenge. And what really made the firm work, and frankly, what created and made those financial instruments work, was people. So for me, I switched my priorities from being that it was all about finance and people were there to serve finance, to putting people on top and saying, actually, it doesn't matter what the topic is, as long as the people are happy and feeling fulfilled, as you describe, in what they're doing, they'll create stuff and they'll do stuff well. So it really needed to be on the focus on the people. So actually, by the end of that 6-year period of my career, I was probably spending 90% of my time thinking about people and 10% of my time thinking about finance. And when
talking about taking a risk, I mean, as you say, I mean, especially in the financial industry, it's still seen to this day as people second, rightly or wrongly, from the outside looking in. And I know from my work in the corporate world that no matter what the industry, this idea that people come first tends to be quite a radical one. I mean, I've worked in specifically leadership development for the last decade or so, and within that time, it's still a marvel how many people leaders struggle to understand that people is your priority. If you're going to be a people leader, they need to be your priority, and you've got to trust that putting that, as you say, 90% of your time into the people will mean that the rest comes along with it, instead of don't put 90% into the spreadsheets, the KPIs, whatever it is. So did you find any resistance during that 6 years? Did you have to kind of convert the world to your way of thinking, or were you lucky enough to have a few key allies in the journey there?
I definitely had key allies. I mean, before I left that firm, the boss I had just before I left the firm, absolutely fantastic. I mean, true champion of people, were just brilliant, hugely inspiring, and I've learned many lessons from her that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. So definitely champions, but I did struggle with being able to take that risk-taking appetite and transferring it to my approach to people. Because I think a lot of the infrastructure of corporates, and this is in no way critical, because I understand that, there's a lot of people working for the firm. So there has to be a process for identifying talent, developing talent, et cetera, because, we can't all sit around all day spending hours and hours and hours talking to each individual in the firm to work out what makes them tick. So I get there needs to be a machine, but that machine needs some sort of scanner built into it that can, when one of those golden nuggets comes through it needs to be able to see them. And I think firms struggle to do that, and understandably, because it's a difficult conundrum.
Yeah.
So what I struggled most with, I think, was being able to apply my risk-taking appetite to the development of people. So for me, for example, I was particularly keen on taking people with less experience and more sort of raw talent and putting them into uncomfortable development situations, which was going to accelerate their growth.
Yeah.
That sounds slightly like I take joy from putting people into uncomfortable positions. I mean, this was all with their permission. Let's be clear. But to take people who weren't playing the game, who weren't lying through the interview, they were just, they had some sort of spark that identified itself. And it wasn't just a series of scripted answers that fitted the sort of selection process keyword search.
Yeah.
But there was something that shone through, and then taking them and putting them into positions that were, yes, uncomfortable for them, but uncomfortable because it meant that they were doing something unusual, which meant they were likely to get unusual results, which meant they were likely to have a sort of an unusual career path, which was likely to be very rewarding. And when I say very rewarding, I don't just mean they're going to get paid more at the end of the year. I mean that they may discover something that they don't like, that they never want to do again. I remember having one particular person who I was very keen managed people, and they hated the idea. And so we gave them a taste of managing people, not because I wanted them to manage people, but because I wanted them to be able to make the decision based on a tangible experience, not just their assumption that they wouldn't like that. Because the assumption that they wouldn't like that was probably rooted in a little bit of that fraudulent feeling that, well, I've never managed people before. So rather than take the risk of managing people, because it's going to make me feel deeply uncomfortable, what I'm going to do is say that I've got no interest in managing people, because then I don't need to take the risk. Turns out they loved it. And have since gone on to be very good at that. So which is fantastic, but it equally could have gone the other way. And I think it takes a degree of open-mindedness on behalf of the person who's encouraging people to take those risks, to not feel that that person has failed if they turn around and say, well, I took the risk, I tried it and I didn't like it. Yeah. And actually I want to rewind the clock and I want to go back to doing something else. And I think sometimes we're guilty of we encourage somebody to do something new, and when they don't like it or they're not very good at it, we think that they've failed at doing that. Well, they didn't. To your point, they just discovered something that didn't really float their boat. It didn't really light their spark, and so they can go off and try something new. So I think your point is really important, because there's a point in there about authenticity and about the way we think about careers, because I think our temptation when we embark on a career, as you say, we're sort of taught subliminally that we're not supposed to enjoy work. And we're also taught that the primary purpose of going to work is to secure money. Yeah. And necessarily that means that when we create our priority list for what we should be looking for in a job, money comes in as number one. Yeah. And the reward system. And somewhere lower down the list comes what makes me happy. And sometimes we forget to include that at all. Yeah. And it really needs to be the other way around. And we need to base our search and where we land on what makes us happy and what allows us to be authentic. Yeah. Because those two are inextricably linked. I'm at my happiest when I'm being myself the most. Yeah. And so, which is why I recoil in horror when I hear terms like your game face. Who wants to spend, we spend a third of our lives at work. Who wants to spend a third of their life not being themselves? It's very odd.
It is, yeah. But it's definitely something that I've done. I've definitely had the work mask, and I actually went through a good portion of my work life feeling like I needed to, and getting quite good at putting on the mask of corporateness and letting enough of myself in not to go completely mad. But it was a revelation to me, and also a privilege, I think, that I got to a stage where I thought, right, just approach everything. Because what I found is when I let more of myself out of the box, even though it terrified some of the people that were leaders of mine in the past or hadn't had some tattooed madman talking to leaders in the past to help develop them, whatever it might be, that every time I actually trusted my instincts and let more of myself out of the box, the feedback I got from the people I was helping was so much better than any time I tried to put the mask on, put a shirt and tie on, whatever it was. But I do think it's also, I know that I'm in a massively privileged position where now if I was to talk to anybody about any opportunity, I would go in with the mindset of here are the things that are important to me. And I know and I'm comfortable with the fact that I'm not for everybody, as nobody is. And it's just about letting them know exactly who I am.
Yeah.
And then it's up to them if that fits with what it is that they want.
Take it or leave it. Exactly. Yeah. Take it or leave it. And I think there's an age aspect and an experience aspect to this, because I think that it's very, very hard to get your mind around that earlier in your career.
Yeah.
Because everything is a big deal. You know, everything, and we're also taught that, you know, you must get the job, you must keep the job, you must perform well in the job, etc. etc. But actually, you're the product, right? You are the product. The authentic version of you is the product. And you're taking yourself out there and you're choosing a firm that you want to give your talents to. And in exchange, you expect them to pay you.
Yeah.
And to give you opportunities to develop and that sort of thing. But you're the product. And it strikes me that it's the only sales process where the customer, which is the firm, sort of, or the customer holds all of that sort of the power and the decision making, and the person who's got the product feels as if they have to not just go out and sell their product. So customer A, you don't like my product, fine, I'm going to go and talk to customer B. But they actually walk up to customer A and say, you don't like my product. Oh, that's okay, I'll change my product then.
Yeah.
And that feels very odd, you know. Rolls-Royce market to people who want luxury cars, and other brands market to people who don't want luxury cars. Yeah. You don't get Rolls-Royce going out and saying, oh, you don't want a luxury car? Well, in that case, let me take all the leather out of it. Let me downgrade you know what I mean? Yeah. You just market to the people who want to buy what you're selling, and what you're selling is the authentic version of you. And I think that's really important. And I think that's something that gets missed. But I also think that something that I think generally people struggle with is we act a certain way and we put that game face on in order to try and perform better, in order to secure the rewards that we're told we're working to secure. But the reality is you will perform best when you're yourself. Yeah. You know, if you take an acting job, you'll spend months and months and months rehearsing how to act as this particular character. Yeah. And then you'll read the reviews afterwards and it will say, you know, not a very realistic portrayal of this, not a very realistic portrayal of that. But imagine walking into an acting job and they just said, we just need you to be you. The person we're trying to portray, you know, imagine you're the star of your own movie. I mean, how easy would that be? You have to do no research at all. You will necessarily, and by definition, perform the role precisely perfectly because you are you. And so when we walk into a role, the best way to sort of do that role is to do it the way you want to do it. Yeah. And the way you think it should be done. And you'll soon find out if people don't like that, and that's fine. Yeah. There's many people, there's many companies, there's many jobs on earth. There will definitely be one, in the same way as they say about dating, there's always someone out there. But, it's the same for roles, right? We shouldn't get too hung up on the sort of, oh my goodness, I've got a job, I must cling on to it no matter what sacrifices I have to make, because losing a job, we call it losing a job, right? But if I choose to walk away from a job, that's fine.
Yeah.
We wouldn't expect you wouldn't, to use the dating parallel again, you wouldn't expect anyone to stay in a relationship that wasn't working for them, right? If a friend of yours came to you and said, I'm in this relationship, and to be honest with you, I don't feel like I can be myself and I hate every minute of it.
Yeah.
But, at least I'm with someone, you'd be like, that doesn't sound very healthy.
Yeah.
You might want to think about whether you want to stay in that relationship. And it's the same with your relationship with a company and a role within that company. So I don't think we should feel too nervous about, being our authentic selves, we're in a role, but also through that process of authenticity, discovering that role or that company is not for us. Yeah. And that we want to change it either within the firm or outside of the firm.
With that in mind, can you remember, and I think you might have started touching upon this, can you remember when you felt like you were turning up as your authentic self at work? Was it something that happened early, or was it something that did take a bit of time for you to understand and feel you could, all of the other things that go along with that?
Yeah, I think so. There was two periods I remember most, where and this is interesting actually, because they were both driven by different things. So the first time was when I'd reached that point of competence. I felt that I held the cards, because now I know mostly that I'm pretty good at this particular topic, and people have started to believe me, and that's feeding my belief in me, and that's making the fraudulent feeling quieter. And at that point, I started to feel like that became a sort of shield, a bit of a force field. So I can afford to be myself now, because they're not going to let that go.
Yeah.
So I can sort of say what I want to say and do what I want to do, because I've finally got to the point where I know that I'm valuable.
Sure.
I don't think that's a very healthy way to feel, or way for that to be achieved, but I certainly got that feeling. And I think the second time was in that last 6-year period. So this is recent. This is within the last 10 years. And during that 6-year period, I was managing people. So I had a team of about 35 to 40 people. And this happened quite suddenly with taking on the team, because I went through a period when I took on the team of a bit of soul searching. And I remember a conversation with that leader I was talking about that gave me that opportunity. And I said to her, I'm trying to work out what sort of leader I want to be. And thinking about that phrase for a moment, it's kind of awful, because it meant I was designing my new game face.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was working out how not to be me. And she replied, why don't you just be yourself? Because that's why I gave you the opportunity. And that really struck me.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what, she's right. Why don't I just do this my way? And I'll see what happens. I could crash and burn. But you know what? I'll have learned a bunch of stuff, and it'll have been a bit of a ride along the way. So let's just see what happens. And so I did exactly that. And she said to me, just stamp your brand on it. And so I did just that. And that gave me a sense that I really needed to I really needed to not act. I really needed to be that honest and authentic version of myself so that other people in the team would see that that was okay. So that we built up that sense of authenticity, and that you don't need to be a fraud, you just need to be you.
Yeah.
And not so much you don't need to be a fraud, but it's okay to feel like a fraud.
Yeah.
That needed to be part of the culture of the team, because that was when we were going to be able to support each other in that. It was when we were going to be able to take those risks individually and as a collective, but feeling like we had a support network around us who understood that we were feeling deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that we felt adventurous enough to be able to inject some of that creativity into what we were doing without fear that injecting that creativity, doing something we'd never done before, would lead to some sort of cataclysmic outcome.
Sure.
And so that was the second period, I think, when I felt okay to just be myself, because that's the culture of the team that I wanted. And I think, I mean, you need to speak to them for the unedited version, but I think that worked quite well.
Yeah.
You know, certainly the feedback that I got from people in the team was that they felt that, and that they enjoyed that experience.
Yeah.
And the variety of things that people sort of went on to do during that 6-year period suggested that it was working in some way.
Yeah. It's almost like you've given them permission to be their authentic selves by doing it yourself. Exactly.
And to reinforce that point that, you know, that fraudulent feeling is the sign that you're doing something exciting.
Yeah.
It's not the sign that you're incompetent in some way.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, everyone's making it up. You know, as I say, there's not some universal truth out there that everyone else is in possession of except for you.
Yeah.
So sort of have at it.
Yeah. So skipping forward to you today. So obviously you're an executive coach, career coach. Coach is a big thing in your life now, helping others to be their authentic self, be confident, be resilient, all of these really important things in a modern workplace. What was it how did you make the leap into this you here now? And is it a case that it was, again, a fraudulent adventure that has got you here? And where are you going from here? Do you even know?
I definitely don't know.
Yeah.
I can tell you that for sure. And if I did, then I'd probably be a bit uncomfortable with it, because I'm not keen on those plans. But so we'll see where it takes me. But yes, it was definitely a fraudulent adventure.
Yeah.
But I also did feel a degree of comfort, because I'd sort of got myself to a point where, much the same as yourself, I think, where I'd had this sort of, what felt like this sort of awakening moment where I realized that it was all a bit of a game.
Yeah.
And everyone was wearing their game face. Everyone was making it up. There was this sort of playoff between risk and reward. There was an absence of authenticity. Authenticity frightened people a little bit. And all of those good things, you know, the resilience was fueled by authenticity. Confidence was born of being your most authentic self. I mean, that kind of, it sounds obvious, but it's surprisingly rare. And so I sort of had this, I call it a moment, but it was probably that 6-year period where I felt like I went through this awakening. And so actually the decision to move from corporate to coaching was really based on two things. One, that realization I was spending 90% of my time thinking about people. So why don't I go and do something that pays me for thinking about people?
Yeah.
And secondly, that I felt like I could benefit those people by telling them this truth I'd woken up to, and being very honest about it, and causing as many of those "Hey, can't say that" moments as possible.
Yeah.
Because that meant that I was sort of holding the mirror up a little bit and saying, really?
Yeah.
And I'm wanting to do that, not for entertainment purposes, but because the earlier that people can realize that, and this is where the career coaching piece comes from, because the earlier we can provide that awakening or give that sort of aha moment to people, I think the more fruitful their careers will be and the more rewarding their careers will be, whatever that means for them. I don't mean necessarily financially, just in terms of them, as you say, finding what makes them tick, the spark that puts the glint in the eye, and then having them spend their time doing that. And to be quite honest with you, I can hear a reaction that is, well, that's all well and good, Adam, but people got to pay the mortgage. So, we have to act a bit to get the money we need to pay the mortgage. And I get that. It's not a zero-sum game. This is about deciding how much you're prepared to trade of your authentic self in order to get what you want.
Yeah.
Because what we need is surprisingly little, actually. It's what we want. And because it's a want, not a need, it's a choice.
Yeah.
And so as you're choosing that career path and deciding what you want to do, being very aware that this is to fuel my wants, and therefore it's a choice. And so how much am I prepared to trade of myself in order to secure those wants is a really important sort of check and balance on yourself. It's very easy when you're with peers or through the whole sort of interview process or through sifting through LinkedIn to get caught up in the idea that you're prepared to trade as much as possible to get as much as possible. And then everyone will think you're successful, and on paper you'll look successful. And when you pop to the pub in the evening, everyone will say, "Oh, haven't you done well? Haven't you done well?" Whilst inside you've got this crushing feeling that for 50% of your waking time on this earth, you're not even being you.
Yeah.
It's very easy to get catapulted into that. And to lose a sense of that check and balance. And we really need to avoid doing that. So I think for me, it felt fraudulent because I'd never been a coach before. I'd done some coaching within a corporate context, but I'd never called myself a coach. But I felt comfortable for those two reasons, really. One, I felt like I'd had the experience and the awakening. And secondly, I wanted to take the risk, but to take the risk in order to help other people to have that sort of that awakening.
Yeah.
Where it goes next, I don't know. I'm enjoying it as it is.
Yeah.
Now, it's fantastic to get to speak to such a variety of people in a variety of industries, at a variety of stages of their career, and all facing a variety of challenges. I don't think I've had one conversation yet throughout that entire time where I haven't spotted that confidence, authenticity, and resilience being authenticity, probably primarily being at the root of whatever the challenge is.
Yeah.
It comes in many different flavors, but it's always sort of there.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm kind of enjoying the moment at the moment.
Yeah.
I've got plans, of course. I've got things that I want to do. But I think I'm enjoying the moment for now. And I think that's okay. As I've said, being a serial risk taker, I'm quite sure it's not long before I wake up one morning and think, hang on a minute, this feels too comfortable.
Yeah.
But that hasn't quite arrived just yet.
Well, I'm excited to see when it does arrive and what it leads to. Adam, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating talking to you. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Long live us frauds, eh?
Yeah. Thank you once again to Adam for joining us for a fascinating conversation. As I said at the beginning, I think it's incredibly powerful to have listened to Adam talk about how through his career, through his development, through his self-realization, how he has taken feelings of being a fraud and turned them into kind of positive fuel to push him to run towards the fraudiness, if you will, and be curious about what that means, why it is that he's feeling that way, and how he can potentially use it to get closer to his more authentic self. It's fascinating. And I think anybody that listens to this, there's loads to take away from it, and not just how excited I am to see where he goes next and where his next adventure, risk-taking, full of feelings of fraud adventure will take him. So watch this space, I'm sure. Finally, this is the last episode of Series 1, so thank you very much if you've joined us for the whole series, or if you've just dipped in and dipped out, or find some things that you like. The whole reason I put this podcast together was me trying to find a way to potentially help those that feel like frauds, whilst not being a fraud myself. So that was what we were going for, and hopefully we have accomplished that. If you think that there is anything that you've heard here that would be of use to others that you know, be of interest to anybody, please take the time to share it. We are on YouTube, where you get this beautiful visual. We are also on Spotify if this beautiful visual is just too much for you. I understand we're all human. And please share it however you share it. Secondly, but not finally this week, please give me feedback. This should be the worst I am at this, and I should get better every time we do one of these, and that will only happen if you help me by giving me feedback. What is it you liked? What is it you don't like? What is it technically that could be better? Anything and everything that will help me get the best out of my already amazing guests. Now, speaking of amazing guests, I've said this is the end of Series 1, and that means that we are going to push on to Series 2 at some point in 2024, and I will tell you more about that in the weeks and months to come, depending on how much I manage to get done and how little I let fraudulent thoughts stop me from pushing on. But it's been a wonderful journey, and I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed making it. Thank you very much, and we will speak soon.